Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and today is really fun and exciting. About a year ago, Randall and I did a show called Growing Old. Actually, it was called Growing Up with radio. So it's August 2021 right now, and MTV just turned 40. Do you know that it turned 40, Randall?
No, I didn't, but yeah,
Yeah.
it gets getting old, Chris.
It's getting old, and so are we. So I thought, you know what? Let's do kind of not a show about like, oh man, I'm gonna give you the history of MTV because I can't do that. And I didn't want to talk about like why MTV sucks now because it's basically a dead channel. But I just wanted to talk about what it was like during our formative years to grow up with MTV. Uh, Before we get into it, though, as always, this is where I ask you to please like, subscribe, comment, and share. Randall, what's the best way to reach us, or what's a way to reach us?
Well, our Facebook page is a good way to leave a comment. Arts Entertainment with Chris and Randall on Facebook. Go to our website, chrisandrandall.com, for different ways to experience our show. Our show is like a normal podcast if you're watching this on video right now, so you can download it.
Yeah, we really want to hear what you think. Are we doing a good job? Are we just blowing it? Is there some episode that you really liked? Is there an episode where like I do not agree with Randall at all, or Chris is so right, or just like, hey, in the future, could you do an episode about the art of the potato peeler? I don't know. We just want to have a conversation going. We love you guys, and it's interesting too because I do look at Randall. I do look at the audience demo stuff on YouTube, and our audience is kind of really our age. You know what I'm saying?
You know what, Chris? Yeah, I look at the statistics a lot, and I'm surprised though that there are a lot of younger people listening to our show. Well, I'm not surprised. I kind of assumed, because of the internet, there's going to be younger people listening to our show, but we have a good number of younger people. I would say like teenagers and people in their 20s and 30s.
Right. I would say that the bulk of the people who are watching and listening to us today are kind of around our age.
Yes. Yes.
Randall,
half of our audience, at least half of our audience, is our age. Yeah.
And Randall, you're what? You're 45 and.
46,
46,
I think.
46, old
I think
man.
I'm 46.
It goes so quick. But anyway, my point is, a lot of you guys out there, probably your experiences growing up with MTV are going to mirror our experiences growing up with MTV. So that's going to be fun. And I really do want to hear like afterwards, like, oh yeah, you forgot to mention, or I really like that too. Now, if you're younger than us, hey, cool. It's like a history show. You'll get a better understanding of your mom and dad. And if you're older than us, well, then this is just going to make you feel that much older. But the good news is, if it wasn't for those of you older than us, there would be no MTV. So this is our debt of gratitude. So MTV started in 1981 with the purpose of being music television. And it would have music videos 24/7. So it was going to be a content channel. We didn't call it that. That was literally you could watch any hour of the day, all week.
Could I talk a little bit about this, Chris?
Yeah.
Yeah, so MTV, when they're first starting up, so the idea is it's going to be radio on television, and they're going to have VJs, right? So instead of DJs, they're going to have VJs, which are video DJs, I guess.
Well, no, in all fairness now, just to add on the VJs, I didn't expect you to go there so quickly. They actually hired disc jockeys.
Right. The first VJs were actual radio disc jockeys that were going to come and spin music on the TV and talk, right? And they were going to be on camera, and they were and instead of like just playing a song, you would play a song in a music video. That was the idea. And I just want to say, like in the very beginning, when they're promoting the channel, they were very hip about it, right? Because they wanted to get like a young. What'd you say the demographic was supposed to be? 12 to 34 in the beginning. They were aiming for.
So when MTV came out, they believed that when they created the show that the demographics was going to be everywhere from ages 12 to as old as 34. But when they actually went on the air and they conducted internal research, they discovered that actually their core audience was about 10 years younger than their eldest. So instead of being 12 to 34, it was 12 to 24. It was very youth oriented. You're really talking about, the very end of the baby boom and the very beginning of Gen X.
So they're aiming for 12 to 34, but they end up getting 12 to 24. And I just want to say, like in the early days, Chris, you remember, I'm sure you remember, they had an ad campaign that was everywhere, right? It was like MTV ads were everywhere on all the TV channels. There was a tagline, "I want my MTV." All they had celebrities say it in their ads. They just, and their ads were their ads were innovative and fun and artsy. They were very hip, weren't they?
Oh, they were. Well, the thing about MTV when it first came out was not everybody had it. The first year it came out, even though it was produced in New York, you could not even get it in New York. So one of their campaign, actually, it's very funny. I want to say this. So MTV's original slogan, which is very prescient, is actually, "You will never look at music the same way again." And the other one, which they used, was "On cable, in stereo." So originally they really did market this. This was an era where like VCRs were coming out, and they wanted to somehow say that this was like a new technology, that this would give your TV the same feeling as your stereo, that this was, an advance in sight and sound.
Yeah, that's a great point. Stereo TV was like a new thing. I'm not sure when stereo TV actually started, but it was. I'm sure in 1981 it was a fairly new technology.
It was a new technology, and at that point you could at least hook up your TV to your stereo system, so you could run your TV through your speakers. So there was almost like a leaning into the high fidelity, and it really did come in for music. I mean, the reason why the VJs were chosen as disc jockeys is the original format of MTV was so close to radio. And it's interesting too, because I was going to get into this later, but I'll get into this now. They had very specific personalities. So they had two young men, Alan Hunter, who was kind of like a cool, good-looking guy who had been a dancer in a David Bowie video. They had Mark Goodman, who was not only a New York DJ, but his wife actually at the time, Carol Miller, was a very prominent New York DJ. And he had that kind of he was an everyman, but a real music nerd and geek who was very irreverent and funny. Then they had Martha Quinn, who had come from NYU. She was actual college radio and was very keyed into what was really new. And then they had, what was the last one? Nina Blackwood. So originally they were going to get Alison Steele, the Nightbird. She was a New York DJ, and she had a very sexy voice, and she was a very edgy woman. And they ended up getting Nina Blackwood, who I'm sure is from some other radio thing, but she brought in a lot of that late 70s boomer-esque kind of, I'm the older person, I'll show you what's around. But my favorite DJ was JJ Jackson, who was clearly the oldest person, the only African-American, and really got excited and really knew his music. I know this is before your time, but
yeah, well, I remember seeing some of those older DJs around. They would come on sometimes, like in retrospective type moments sometimes. But
so you can see how each of those DJs were plugged into that demographic of either appealing to like the youngest contingent or the oldest contingent.
Well, it was very much an old radio format where the DJs, the VJs in this case, needed to understand the music of their demographic and help program for the taste of that demographic.
And prior to 1984, much like a lot of FM radio that these VJs came from, they were using a format called AOR, which was album-oriented rock radio. So for those of you who don't know what the heck I'm talking about, most of the radio back in the late 70s to early 80s would either be top 40, and top 40 is anything that is in the top 40 of the Billboard charts. Doesn't have to be rock. It can be anything as long as it's popular. And then album-oriented rock tends to be a popular band or artist, and not just their hit song, but like a deep cut. And it also meant that you'd hear a lot of songs by a few artists. So really one of the most, like Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, The Who, if you were into older music, The Clash, the Talking Heads, if you were into new music. So instead of just hearing, it normally would hear about 4 songs off of 3 to 4 songs off of any given album. And you might hear anywhere from 10 songs off of their entire work. This is why, like, I think the most album-oriented rock band in history, which somehow made it to top 40, is the Eagles, right? Randall, you know, how many Eagles songs do you know?
Well, I know Hotel California.
You probably know 15 Eagles songs if I put a gun to your head and I was going to kill everyone you knew and loved. But the only reason why everyone knew the Eagles so much isn't so because we all owned the Eagles albums. It's because, and the Eagles only had so many albums at that period. It's just that every album they had on album-oriented radio on AOR would at least pick 3 to 4 of those songs so that you would hear them every day. So I come in around this period, Rand.
Yeah, how old were you when you started watching?
So it did not get to, it's very weird. You know, I didn't live that far from where they filmed the show at all, maybe like, 30 blocks, which is about a mile and a half. But it originally started out in Florida in 81. It did not come to New York until the last week of December 1982. When you talk about I Want My MTV, that was actually a campaign to get people to call their cable providers because Sting or Peter Townsend or Rod Stewart said, call up your cable providers and say, I want my MTV, because they weren't really excited to carry it. And I vividly remember this because it was December 31st, which is literally like just the night before New Year's. And my mom's away with her boyfriend somewhere, and we're at home. It's just my sister and I sitting in my mom's bedroom watching TV. And we just found out, I think we found out from one of her friends that we could finally get MTV, something that we'd both been hearing about for over a year as being really hip and cool and cutting edge. Keep in mind, we had seen music videos before. I mean, music, let's see, there's the thing called Don Kirshner's Rock Concert, Casey Kasem's American's Top 40, and
yeah, these are just TV shows on network TV, right?
Right. So they would show you the occasional video, and clubs in New York City did show videos. I would go to the clubs and see them. So it's not that I hadn't seen videos, but the idea that we could just sit and just watch videos endlessly. I remember I ended up going to a party and staying over at a friend's. And when I came back the next day, my sister had never left the bed. She had just camped out on my mom's bed. That's how I remember it. So Gwen,
watching videos, watching music videos.
But just watching it. And I remember when I came back, because her mom wouldn't be home for a couple hours, just watching it with her. And I will say,
well, how old was your sister?
My sister was 2 years younger than me. She was in 15. So we were teenagers, and we were glued in the way that people who play computer video games are glued. How old were you, man, when you started watching? What year?
Well, I had a childhood of much deprivation, I would say, Chris. I didn't have cable till I was in high school, and then I started watching it. I was able to see MTV, and my era of MTV was the Headbangers Ball era. It was a lot of hair bands. What?
Was that Ricky Ratman who was the host?
Ricky Rackman was the yes, he was the host of Headbangers Ball. It was a show on MTV, but it wasn't. But MTV was like almost all like hair bands.
Was that 1991?
I would say it was the early '80s, or not early '80s, but the late '80s to the throughout the '90s until grunge really hit.
Yeah, you'd been like what, 14?
Yeah, I would have been like 13. Yeah.
around 13, 14, high school, middle school
Yeah, that's
era.
right. That's right.
So you were a little younger than me, but not much. So you two just kind of came into it right around the same time that you're coming into adolescence.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, that was the hair band. That was what? That was when Guns N' Roses and Poison and Motley Crue.
You got it. That's right.
And I'm sure, like, did you go to school with kids who just had the look?
Yeah, so my generation, I would say, was like just all into heavy metal and headbanging type music. The hair, the leather, belts, just the whole thing, man. Anarchy symbols, the whole thing. It was like, it was big.
So I would guess it's interesting. So yeah, for you, it's really more. It was an established thing already. Did you find yourself watching it incessantly when it first came out?
Well, I didn't really like that kind of music, I mean, I guess grunge was kind of like a backlash to that kind of music because Kurt Cobain comes in and he's not wearing any makeup. He's not doing his hair. His hair is long, but it's not done, and he's wearing normal street clothes. That was like a total reaction against the hair bands of the time.
So Smells Like Teen Spirit is what, 91?
Yeah, I have to look it up. That sounds right. But here's the thing.
First 2 years, it's just like metal, metal, metal.
Yeah, it's wall to wall. But I'll tell you a story since we're going off on a tangent now. So there was a show on MTV late at night called 120 Minutes.
Yeah, I love that. I was going to get to it, but we'll get to it now.
And 120 Minutes was this show. Matt Pinfield, I think, was the host of that show. And yeah. Matt Pinfield was one of the, I don't know when MTV hired him, but he was one of the old original VJs. Maybe not totally original, but he was one of the...
Matt Pinfield came in later. There was an English guy originally who was the host of 120 Minutes. Matt Pinfield was a disc jockey at Rutgers, New Brunswick. And I know this for a fact because when I was at Rutgers, New Brunswick, I had just missed him. But friends of mine who had been at Rutgers just a year or two before knew Matt, and he was just a hardcore music geek.
Right. Well, this is what I want to say
from an English guy, yeah.
Exactly. Well, this is what I want to say about Matt Pinfield. He's one of the old school VJs, personalities, faces on MTV, a guy that actually knew music, that actually helped, shape the taste of what was being shown on MTV. And he had a show on MTV, 120 Minutes, and it just shows, like, when I was watching MTV, it just shows how on the way out Matt Pinfield's type was, because 120 Minutes was relegated to, like, sometimes it would come on at 3 a.m. I remember staying up late, waiting for it to come on sometimes. it would come on, like, really late. MTV would just put it on whenever they felt like it, it would seem like.
While we're talking about 120 Minutes, go ahead. I just want to open the discussion now to 120 Minutes so we don't have to go backwards later. So if you want to talk about the fall, can I at least start by talking about the rise?
Well, just let me finish what I was going to say.
Okay.
So 120 Minutes, it'd be on late at night, and Pinfield would just, like, rotate, just play, like, seemingly like whatever he wanted to play. And there was this type of music called alternative at the time, and I don't even know if that kind of genre exists anymore, but that alternative existed as a genre really shows, like, what music was going through at the time. So you had all these hair bands that were rocking it, that were, like, taking all the air out of the room, and MTV was playing them incessantly. I guess they were making a lot of money off of them. And then you had a reaction to that called alternative music, and Pinfield was set up the main outpost of that kind of stuff late at night. So what happened was he started playing Nirvana. And for like a year, he was playing, like, Teen Spirit, and nobody cared. For like a year, I remember watching it and thinking, wow, that's a great video. So for a year, he plays Teen Spirit, and then finally, it just exploded. It took it like a year of play or something, and then it exploded, and literally, like, overnight, MTV started playing Teen Spirit, like, where they used to play the headbanging bands. So I'd come home from school, and they would be playing Teen Spirit instead of the headbanging bands. And they were playing, and Teen Spirit was so huge that they were playing it back to back sometimes. I remember seeing it like 3-4 times a day on MTV. It was ridiculous.
Heavy rotation.
But anyway, I'm done.
I was gonna say, well, no, we'll get back to 120 Minutes in a bit.
But see, Pinfield. I think Pinfield broke Nirvana on MTV just because he liked Nirvana.
Well, absolutely. But we're going to talk about the music in just a minute. But I weirdly enough thought before talking about the music, uh, I just wanted to talk about the video, the experience of watching videos. And I mean, I guess just speaking for myself, what was it like? I mean, as I said to you before, I had seen videos, but and we're gonna do a show, I promise, folks, on the art and entertainment of music videos of itself. But you and I had both seen music videos pre MTV, right?
Yeah, so music videos have always been around. I would say, like, originally they were like inside the industry promos that music artists would make for like other people in the industry. So you can actually go on YouTube and watch some of these old videos, and they're probably promos that they would send to like radio stations or other people in the industry just to promote the artist, and like the public would never see these things. And so MTV, so this is one of the reasons MTV started, because there were all these promo videos that never got shown, and somebody had the bright idea, oh, let's make a TV channel and we'll show all these promo videos.
Well, there have been video programs before, and actually it goes all the way back to the 1960s, where there was a few companies that would literally record everybody for promotional, and they would air it on Top of the Pops. And there's a few other European shows that would just air video clips. In fact, even A Hard Day's Night has promo videos, which is kind of cool if you ever want to watch them. But it was interesting to me because, and we're going to include, for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, we're going to include the first 2 hours of MTV as it premiered in 1981. And what you will see is they did not have a lot of content because, as you just pointed out, Randall, this was really not a lot. It was not done for a lot of artists. You had a lot of concert footage, but you really didn't have, as you say, promo footage. So, everybody knows the first video, right? What's the first video ever played on MTV?
I don't know, Chris. I used to know this. Is it Dire Straits?
No.
No.
That would come later. Okay, young boy. It was Video Killed.
Oh, Video Killed the Radio Star. Right.
Yeah, Kill the Radio Star by the Buggles, which was actually Trevor Horn, who would go on to produce a lot of great albums in the 80s, came from some great music in the 70s. That album and that song is from 1979. It was very hip, very new wave. Now, I'm growing up in New York City, so I have access to what they would call new wave music or alternative music at that time. Also, where I went to high school, I went to a boarding school. I was right next door to Vassar College, which is where my sister would end up going to school. And I would listen to Vassar College radio. So I actually was very familiar with the songs per se, but not so much the images. But what's really interesting about it is not, I would argue, that song for video. It's a great video, by the way. It really holds up. You've seen the video, right?
Yes, of course. Yeah, MTV played it many times.
But the production values are good in that, right? There's a lot going on in that video. They're wearing costumes. They've got different kinds of shots, and it's an unheard of band, in all fairness, right? The Buggles were not a well-known band.
Well, I don't know. You would know more about this than me, but yeah, MTV liked it because of the obvious
because of the whole point of
nature, the ideological nature. Yes, it's the MTV manifesto. Yes, exactly.
Right. But here's where I think it gets interesting. No one ever talks about the next video they played. And the next video they played is You Better Run by Pat Benatar. Now, this I think is really important because, Pat Benatar was part of the new generation of female, we called them punk at the time. Now I think they're just straight ahead rock and roll. But you had like a band like Scandal with Patti Smythe. You obviously had Deborah Harry of Blondie, even though at this point the sun was setting on their career. But you had these very young, attractive women, right? You've seen Pat Benatar in the 80s?
Yes.
Right. She was she had rock and roll swagger, right? She knew how to belt. She had her husband just really was a kick-ass guitarist. And, there is Pat Benatar in tight leather pants and a short crop T-shirt, looking like a female Mick Jagger, saying, what you gonna do with my heart? And what's very clear, and what no one ever really talks about. And then the next video is Rod Stewart, is that MTV at its inception understood sex appeal. You know what I'm saying? The music video had either the fantasy of the Buggles, or it had the sex appeal of good looking.
Well,
sex.
It's
and
interesting.
I just want to get this point. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because some people believe that there's certain artists that come after MTV that they wouldn't have made it without MTV. So, for instance, Madonna, who made very sexy music videos and is a very attractive woman physically, and there you go.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because my senior year of high school, I was with a buddy in New York City, and we decided only like 2 teenagers would do this. We were going to watch 50 videos in a row and grade and evaluate each video. Can you believe we did this?
Well, you sound like a wild man in high school, Chris.
No, it was a guy with way too much time. I'll get to why videos really became, like, 83 was a watershed year in video, because that's when Thriller comes out. And
Michael
really,
Jackson, he's another person that people credit of making it because of MTV. He made the Thriller video. That's right.
It's directed by John Landis, who's a filmmaker. The makeup is by Tom Savini, who had done American Werewolf, I think it was a couple $1 million. It was the most expensive. There was a 9-minute version and a 12-minute version.
Right, and then he sold VHS tapes of the making of and the extended version of Thriller, and everybody bought one. It was huge.
It told a full story. It was really cinematic in scope.
It was a mini movie.
It was a mini movie. Now, we'll do a whole thing on music videos later, but I just wanted to say that in just going from like 1980, December of 82 to the very beginning of 1984, which is only a year, really, less than a year, it was amazing to see how much money started coming in really quickly, how much production values started to amp up, and how picky, weirdly enough, to the point that I could, with a buddy, say, oh, wow, there's so many videos a year later that we can just stay up all night and watch 50 videos. And I remember the video that struck me the most. I believe it was Martha Quinn who introduced this New York artist. That's how she described her. A New York artist. Like, oh, wow, this is cool. This is very, whatever. And it was Borderline by Madonna, who clearly looked so freaking beautiful. And I remember not only enjoying the song, but I really enjoyed watching her. And you've seen the video, right?
Yes.
Good video, shot outdoors, tells a story, good production values. The song really works.
So MTV
works.
Yeah, so MTV starts. They're showing old promo videos for all these bands. They dig up the Buggles video because it's like their manifesto. And then a year or two in, the artists start getting wise, right? And Madonna's like this New York club personality. She's performing all these nightclubs, and she has a whole act where she basically wears lingerie on stage. And so Madonna and Michael Jackson, they get hip to MTV, and they start making content specifically for MTV. I mean, the Thriller album is maybe like conceptually put together for MTV, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe we'll just
and
do
it launches these people.
You're right.
Yeah, and it launches these people. Madonna, Michael Jackson launches these people in the stratosphere. It's like a symbiosis between them and MTV, right?
So it's so interesting because when you first see Madonna, she's not dressed in lingerie. She's just dressed in really cool, hip East Village clothing. Not at all funky, cool, and interesting. And in a way that's not even quite as slick as Pat Benatar. She really looks kind of like the way people feel about Lady Gaga at the beginning, which is, this is someone, and not by accident, who really understands the New York look. And the funniest part was, Randall, I had heard Madonna a year prior to her big video debut, because she had a hit called Holiday, which was her first radio hit, not a video, but a radio hit. Holiday was originally just something you'd hear in the clubs, and you wouldn't hear it on rock stations, but you'd hear it on the disco stations. And because you could hear it on Top 40 and you could hear it on disco, but you never saw Madonna, me and many other people thought Madonna was black.
Are you serious?
100%. We all thought Madonna was black.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that. I guess so.
Prior to that. So it was very weird that, we thought she was black, and then no, she's white. And interestingly enough, just around the same time that Madonna's breaking, so is Cyndi Lauper, who I also know from the New York club scene. Like Madonna, they would play places like the Ritz, the Palladium. They were very much East Village people. Not a knock on Cyndi Lauper, who was like in her mid-30s when she broke. She was not as pretty as some of the women I've just mentioned, but she was so cool because she had her own style, also grounded in a very hip New York look, had a great voice, and had great production values, and also kind of really showed that, you didn't have to just sell sex in video, but you had to sell that aesthetic.
Yeah, that really shows the difference, Lauper versus Madonna. I mean, I remember at the time they were talked about in the same breath, and Madonna, obviously, she was like, sex appeal was one of her weapons in sales, and Cyndi Lauper, it was like when they sold her, they just sold her on her voice.
And then you had bands that just really, had great videos and a great look, like Duran Duran always wore amazing clothes, shot in beautiful locations. They were very popular in the New York club scene with their videos, and they were just very cool. Rio being one of my favorites for the way they're dressed, for the way things look. And while they may have been very chic and very hip, ZZ Top was just the opposite, right? They were almost like cartoon characters.
Yeah, ZZ Top, I mean, they had the long beards. Their music was great though. I mean, ZZ Top's one of the great all-time rock bands.
And they were such a 70s rock band. So they were part of the other thing you started to see, which is established bands trying to get hip to the new generation. And what they did that was so cool is instead of making them look hip, they just put them in very hip situations and let them look like ZZ Top. Billy, what was his name? Billy Gibbons, the late Dusty, I cannot remember his last name. But these guys were just scruffy guys. And they would just put them in like, black sunglasses and long coats and just let them tell stories about other people. There's an interview with Mike Nesmith, who did a series of rock videos in the mid-70s called Animal Parts. Mike Nesmith was in the Monkees. And he is credited by a lot of people as the first person not to make music videos, but to make what they call concept music videos, where you have costumes and you have different cinematic things. And he said for him, his two greatest influences were cartoons and porn. And in a weird way, I really do think, like for me, videos of that era really kind of fall into that tableau of somewhere between cartoons and pornography.
Well, I want to just say...
Not pornography, but pornography.
Well, I just want to say about pornography. There was a certain aesthetic that pornography had, like in the... I want to say, like, adult movies really start somewhere in the 60s, and then throughout till the 80s, the video VHS era. There's this aesthetic that they're really low budget films.
Yeah.
And so the obvious selling point is nude women in these movies. I mean, some of these movies don't even have actual intercourse, but the actual selling point is nude women, but because everything else doesn't matter that much, they do whatever they want. They have any kind of aesthetic they want. They just don't want to spend a lot of money. I mean, one of the kings of this aesthetic is Russ Myers, who's like a cinematic genius in a lot of ways. We should do a show on him, Chris. But yeah, so I could totally see why he's influenced by that era. I mean, because like the modern era of pornographic videos, it's nothing like that era of like the 60s to the 80s, I just want to say.
No, that makes sense, and that really is a part of it. So let's just talk about the music. Again, I would say that, it's interesting for me because I did have access to some non-mainstream radio. Radio was very conservative at the time. Either if you weren't into disco, you weren't really hearing you did hear a lot of like boomer music. Sorry, guys, but there's a lot of 70s music on the radio. You would hear some new music on the radio, but it was mostly the college stations or the left of the dial stations. So I would say that for me, a lot of my introduction, I knew about new wave. That was not a problem in the New Romantics. But there was another era of what I would call Brit pop. So people like Paul Young, who isn't really a new wave artist, just an Englishman with a good voice, or people like U2, which I did hear but didn't see. Duran Duran, basically my understanding of Duran Duran, Depeche Mode, that comes from watching and not from listening. So I would say, weirdly enough, that MTV in many ways supplanted the radio for me. I always loved listening to radio, but when MTV came with its much more progressive and inclusive, or at least music I kind of liked, I started drifting away from leaving the radio on when I'm at home to leaving the TV on to MTV. I definitely would agree with you. 120 minutes when it came out, I think I might have been in college by that point, so like 84. And I was starting to actually sit with my buddies in the TV lounge and make fun of bad videos. There's a guy named John Parr who did the St. Elmo's Fire video, but he also did one called Naughty Naughty. It was just so overly sexualized. So we would just get drunk and make fun of it. But when 120 Minutes came out, which had an English host, I should have researched his name. It was 2 hours. It was, I think, either on a Saturday or Sunday. It was a lot like another show. There's a guy named Rodney Bingenheimer here in LA. You know him, right? Rodney on the Rock.
Rodney on the Rock.
And Rodney had been around, what, since the 70s?
Yeah, so Rodney's famous for bringing David Bowie to America, introducing David Bowie to American audiences.
So there's a radio station out here called, what is it called? KROQ, or K-Rock. And they were really, one of the innovators was Rodney Bingenheimer in getting a lot of new wave music, British music, punk music into radio in the 70s and early 80s. And I would say that a show in Long Island called a station called WDRE, which was basically our answer to K-Rock, and they had a show called Off the Boat. So these shows, which are the predecessor of 120 Minutes, their big thing was to show you music you wouldn't hear anywhere else. So part of 120 Minutes was very good at featuring, English bands, but it was also really good at giving access to indie bands that were coming out of what would become alternative. So I heard like the Hoodoo Gurus, or I heard the Smithereens. So it wasn't just English, but actually the Hoodoo Gurus are from Australia. But I would hear bands like the Smithereens, who were from New Jersey, and it was the only place you could really hear it. And I think they really were, as you said, the culmination of 120 Minutes is Smells Like Teen Spirit, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's the biggest thing that ever came out of 120 Minutes, and it changed, and it eventually, I mean, you watched 120 Minutes and you knew that eventually MTV would be 120 Minutes. Like 120 Minutes had to be the future of MTV, because like MTV couldn't be hair bands forever. But it's funny because when Nirvana broke, what really happened wasn't that MTV became 120 Minutes. It was that, although a little bit maybe, but it was that MTV just became Nirvana and clones of Nirvana. And so that was like what you got throughout the end of the 90s.
Well, I think you're being a little harsh. I think it gave room for grunge and alternate music bands that opened the door for bands that were excellent, like Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains. They're not Nirvana ripoffs. They're solid bands. And, as 120 Minutes became a nightly show, and as their programming format really started to include a lot more, not only just more grunge, but in your era, you had more Britpop, you had more electronica. Did you like the music?
Yeah, well, yes, post-Nirvana, yes. I love Nirvana and post-Nirvana music on MTV, yeah. I mean, the hair band stuff, the heavy metal stuff, I mean, I enjoyed it somewhat, but I don't know. I wasn't really that into it. I had friends that were like super into that stuff. I mean, I never understood how they could be so into those bands. But those bands like Poison, what are we talking about? Poison, Metallica, those hair bands, Twisted Sister. I mean, those hair bands. I knew people in high school that, I mean, that was their whole life, man. They love that stuff.
So I was going to say, in college, I mentioned how I actually liked watching MTV. It was a very love-hate relationship by that point because I would mock the really bad videos. But I went to college in the Midwest, and sometimes there was just something refreshing about the New York hipness, the cutting-edge hipness of MTV at that point in the 80s that kind of helped me feel like, oh, yeah, there's still like a world out there where people are being daring. On an aesthetic level, what did you think of the aesthetic?
Well, post Nirvana, it was great, and that was like a moment where MTV was the greatest it ever was. I think. I mean, aside from maybe the very early days, which I wasn't able to watch that much, but yeah, the Nirvana era that was amazing because it was like MTV. It was almost like MTV didn't know what to do. It was like everybody wanted to watch Nirvana, everybody wanted to watch Teen Spirit for a while, so they played it, and it was like nobody wanted to watch anything else because all the hair bands are out. So they had to find some other bands, you know, and they did, and it was a great era. There was a lot of, like you say, you know, there was a lot more variety than there was previously. It was like MTV finally became 120 minutes. I mean, not to the extent 120 minutes was, unfortunately, but it went in that direction. And then, you know, Kurt Cobain killed himself, and that door kind of closed. 120. Total Request Live became a show, which
right, but that's kind of later, right? You were
right. This is when the era ends. Like I think when Total Request Live comes in, and Total Request Live is kind of like a Top of the Pops, if you ever from British TV, and it's kind of like it's like an excuse. It's like a manufacturing consent to. It's like the manufacturing consent version of pop radio, you know, to reference Noam Chomsky.
Did you find yourself, though, very influenced by it on an aesthetic level? Like for myself,
yes.
Clearly, when I was in high school, the clothing that bands like Duran Duran would wear, I know where they got it. I know that they were wearing parachute pants and Tonserton shirts, and I knew where to go in New York City to buy those clothes. And I would, as close as I could afford, because they wore much better clothes than I could afford, I would do whatever I could, either buy the high-end clothing knockoffs, or I would go down to the thrift stores and copy that thrift store look. So on a very visual level, at least as clothing, it really affected me. How about you? Did you find that the aesthetics affected your choices as a teenager?
Yeah, for sure. Especially in college. I mean, it affected me and everybody around me. I mean, that Kurt Cobain. I mean, it was Kurt Cobain's aesthetic. I mean, we're all wearing old clothes. We're all wearing thrift store clothes. We're all wearing. We're duct taping our shoes if they're falling apart.
Yeah.
We're buying old work clothes like jumpsuits from the thrift store. You know, the more grungy it is, the better. You know, and I remember there was even a fashion designer that tried to come out with a grunge line one time. So it was like on the Paris runway or something. You had models walking down the runway in flannel and old jeans and stuff like that. I mean, it was supposed to look like that, but you know, it was.
Now, I would argue
clothes.
You have an even more personal relationship than I do to MTV videos of that era because you're in one. Randall's
yeah. So when I was in college, I tried to get some acting work. I moved to LA, and I signed with this agency. It was like a background talent agency and extras, and they got me into a Radiohead video. I was in this video called Fake Plastic Trees for Radiohead. I was on set with Radiohead like all day one day.
Directed by Jake Scott.
Yeah. Ridley Scott's son, right?
Yeah.
I didn't talk to him.
Actually, no. Tony Scott's son, the one who did Top Gun.
Okay. Well, I didn't talk to him that much, but yeah.
Ridley Scott's nephew.
Yeah, it was cool. You know, everybody was great on that set. I mean, it wasn't like one of these nightmare sets. It was great. It was very relaxed, and everybody was working, and you know.
So do you remember watching the video on MTV?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I didn't think I'd be in it so much, but he liked me so much, he like kind of featured me in the video, and yeah, so I was pretty surprised by that. It didn't play that much though, Chris. It didn't play that much in that era.
It did play enough for people to watch it. By the way, folks, again, if you're on YouTube, we will hold that clip there. You can see a young Randall Mills.
Yeah.
Did anybody come up to any of your friends?
Nobody ever recognized me from that video, Chris. Nobody.
Here
Nobody.
You are in what I would consider still not an unpopular it was a more, you're not giving it credit. I watched it. It was popular. Everyone loved Radiohead in the late 90s, and it did get plenty of play, but no one ever, it never
Only
okay.
like
Well,
ex-girlfriends would Google me or something, and they'd find the video, something like that.
well, at least it's a piece of history that will never go. So the last question I have for both of us is, what do you think is the legacy of early MTV on our youth? Looking back,
it's hard to say because it's one of those things where when MTV was the greatest, they probably got the worst ratings. So I don't know what to say. I don't know what they think about.
Well, like I think, for example, that it did create an expectation that moving forward we would see the artist. When I was growing up until the age of 17, I certainly knew from like album covers and concert stuff what the artist looked like, but I didn't really like think when I heard the song. I would just hear the song in my head. Maybe I would imagine what was going on in the song. Maybe I'd create my own story.
Yeah,
Maybe
that's
I'd
true.
Imagine the singer. But then once the song became so intimately connected with the video, it was impossible to separate the video. And once the artist became a constant visual phenomena, I could always see, to this day, I can always see Madonna in my head whenever I hear a Madonna song. Not only do I see Madonna in my head, but I normally see the video that I've watched 1,000 times. Whereas like when I listen to Whole Lotta Love by Led Zeppelin, I don't really think much about anything beyond the song. I don't go, oh, here comes the solo, here comes that, but I don't really go, oh yeah, man.
Yeah, that's true. That's true what you're saying. I mean, my mother told me one time that when she was a kid, they had no idea what any of the musicians looked like. And if you look at albums from pre-1980, you'll see any album where the artist isn't on the cover, which is a lot of them. There's no the people have no idea what the artist looks like.
Yeah,
and you're right. Today, like if an artist releases a song, people want to go to YouTube and watch the video and see what they look like.
I think one of the reasons why MTV at the beginning leaned in so heavily into new wave is because modern rock and roll from like the 60s to early 70s, the boomer rock, those cats, men and women, they were, by the time 1981 rolls around, they're in their 30s and 40s. And they have no desire to dress in an attention-getting way. They wear tailored suits or they wear rugby shirts, but they no longer care about their aesthetic. So I will say that at least the new wave kids had an aesthetic in their clothing choices, just like the hip hop kids would come later, had an aesthetic. And I do believe that one of the things that always gets people on MTV is a defined look. They don't have to be good looking. They just have to have a look.
I never thought of that before, Chris, but that really explains the Headbanger era, because that was kind of like that Headbanger era on MTV was kind of like when MTV peaked, like probably in terms of numbers.
Yeah.
And there was a definite like aesthetic from that era. I mean, everybody knew what it was. Everybody did it. The decline of Western Civilization Part 2, I think it is like a perfect documentary of that era.
Yeah. And I also think another thing of the legacy is the rise of dance music. It's very hard to believe now, but when I was a teenager, we had very little dance music up to the early 80s, like middle school. Once disco faded, which was like 79 to around 81, there was some kind of dance music, but a lot of like mainstream people's taste in music, like Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, did not inherently sound like dance music. Whereas even the Talking Heads is very hard mostly to dance to. Not the B-52s. They were awesome. But the B-52s would talk about how they'd play CBGB in the late 70s, and they'd say, hey, everybody, let's dance. And no one would, because no one knew how to do more than a pogo. So I think when you start to get people like Michael Jackson, when you start to get Madonna, who are trained dancers, when Flashdance became the first music from a movie trailer which has dancing, all of a sudden I think watching people dance has always been one of cinema's great abilities in music, right? I mean, there's something about choreography and how the camera works, right? I mean, as good as singing a song is, watching someone dance while singing a song, that's much better, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, well, movie musicals go back a long time, and yeah, it's always been very. They were always very popular, but now, yeah, and I think maybe in the post MTV era, you almost don't need movie musicals anymore. You can see they've really gone on the
Well, but
outs.
right. So, but MTV, even to this very day, is a movie musical. Even when you're
Right.
watching BTS, I mean, not saying MTV now because we get our videos on YouTube, but prior to, I think one of the great legacies is that it switched from what was really a band playing and just jamming out to, which was the expectation of watching musicians working really hard, to can I see some dancing and can I in turn dance to it. I think the last thing I would say is that it created what I call micro entertainment, which is, again, like back in the day, it's really hard to imagine when there was no internet and when cable was very limited. But back in the day, if you had a couple of minutes, yeah, you could watch an old rerun of a TV show, or you could watch a clip of a game show, but you were never going to see how it ended because maybe you only got a 10-minute break. You only got 5 minutes to kill. So if you want it created this thing. Yeah, CNN existed back then, but how many teenagers really want to watch 22 minutes of news? But as a teen, I used to just leave the radio on in the background and listen to music. But now all of a sudden, if I only had 5 minutes or 10 minutes and I wanted to be entertained, it created what we now take for granted on the internet as short form entertainment content.
Well, you're making it sound like TikTok is the modern successor to MTV.
Maybe it has, maybe that's the difference between the Gen X people, is that we're used to, and older millennials, thinking that short-term entertainment is a 4-minute video, as opposed to, I don't know how long TikTok is, but it's much shorter. But I do think that that's the legacy for us too, because to this day, do you like to leave the TV on sometimes just for entertainment, or do you go back to radio?
Chris, I have found in the internet era, I am much more deliberate about what I watch. I mean, sometimes I'll leave the news on and like surf the internet, but yeah, I'm much more deliberate because you can pick and choose what you want to watch now.
That's true, and I often will just leave the news on to make sure there's some news break, or if I will, I'll just listen to like Spotify and just listen to the music that I know I'm going to hear. So there's not a lot of spontaneity anymore in the music I listen to. There's not a lot of novelty. The news is much depressing versus watching videos. The world is burning as we speak. But it did shape me, and it'll always be a happy memory, which is why, again, if you want, you can watch if you're listening to us and you go on YouTube, you can Google MTV, and you'll find pretty early on the first 2 hours. So if you don't have access to the YouTube here, you can see it there. And again, if you want to see Randall, that would be Fake Plastic Trees.
I'll link to it.
But again, if you don't have that access, that's
and I'll just
recommend.
I just want to say, like, the highlight of MTV to me was late at night in high school waiting for 120 minutes to come on, and then watching the weird videos Matt Pinfield would choose to play for us.
That's so true. And we haven't even touched the surface about the TV shows, which were great, like Liquid Television and the original Jon Stewart show, or Singled Out. The reason we didn't is because today we're just talking about how the music influenced us. Or I'm sorry, I completely forgot to mention how much I enjoyed Unplugged, because it's just very neat to see established music. And that was neat because I do think they were responsible for the rise of acoustic music in the 90s, and hearing your favorite artists doing that. I also loved it when they let the musicians take over this, for an hour or a day. I remember once watching Courtney Love, like she had been up for 24 hours, clearly drunk, clearly high, just rambling and picking videos. And I loved whenever they would do the interviews or have these musicians on or do the rock news, or the VJs would get into it, because you did get to see something. You got to see a part of youth culture and alternative culture you could not find in the more conservative era of TV. Now you can, but back then, youth, drugs, sex, rock and roll, even issues like apartheid and AIDS, they just weren't really being dealt with at the level that you and I were living. They were being dealt with by men in suits, women in bouffant hair, so that it was on our level. And we'll talk about it another time. But for today, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
It's been a pleasure. We'll talk again.
Bye.
Bye.